Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am the Robert Herstick Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Executive Medical Director of Northwestern Simulation. I'd like to welcome you back to another podcast in our series on simulation and healthcare education. Today, I have the distinct honor of interviewing Dr. Paul Phrampus. Paul currently serves as the Director of the Peter M. Winter Institute for Simulation, Education, and Research, otherwise known as WISER, in the Department of Anesthesia at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. He also serves as the Medical Director for Patient Safety in the same health network that his simulation lab, WISER, serves. Of note, he was also a former president of the Society for Simulation and Healthcare. Today, we're going to be discussing Paul's role at WISER and his faculty development programs that he has developed and has become internationally renowned for within simulation. Paul, it's an honor to interview you today.
Thanks, Jeff. It's quite an honor to be here and be interviewed by you, another leader in simulation.
Well, I appreciate that. We usually start our podcasts with a little bit about background and how you got involved in simulation. So if you could start with that, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. Mine's a long, twisted tale of many different careers. It started out as a volunteer EMT when I was in high school in New Jersey, and that was my first inroads into medicine. And I left New Jersey a long, long time ago and joined the United States Navy. And in that world, I was in the electronics business. I was an electronics technician, and I worked on radars and computer systems that supported a lot of aviation and aircraft things. I was stationed on an aircraft carrier for 39 months and developed my full-on technical geek prowess that just gave me, a background in all things electronics, technical, and geeky things. And during my tenure in the Navy, I started teaching a lot of electronics and was helping my colleagues study for in-training service exams and those kinds of things, and developed a pathway of education. When I wound up my Navy career, I started going to undergrad at Old Dominion University, and through my EMT and paramedic experience and that medical pathway, decided to go to medical school. And I kind of went through medical school, and then when I landed in Pittsburgh in residency, I kind of tied those three threads together of medicine, technology, and this sort of penchant for teaching and education, and was fortunate enough to meet my mentor and my eventual mentor in simulation, Dr. John Schaefer, when I was just an intern at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'd say at that point, I started working on doing some simulations for the city of Pittsburgh paramedics, and I guess the rest is history in terms of my career. It just I got addicted, like so many of us back then, in simulation, and kept going, and that became a cornerstone of my career.
One of the unique things that I think you bring to the table too is your experience with the U.S. Navy. As you know, deliberate practice is near and dear to our hearts here at Northwestern within Mastery Learning. And, I know when you look at how professionals train in something that's high stakes, like getting planes up in the air from an aircraft carrier, getting them down safely and doing missions, there had to be a lot of simulations. Can you talk about how your simulation experience in the Navy kind of also helped develop your interest in sim?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing is kind of when you're going through it at the time, you don't even realize that you're working on something to become a future interest. And one of the things that was part and parcel to my world and eventually ending up in simulation was my basic electronics and electricity training in the Navy, and then my specialty training as an electronics technician, and then going on to do specialty training on some pieces of equipment. Each stage of the way was actually filled with deliberate practice and simulation. Of course, it wasn't called that back then, but we would do didactic lectures lectures. It was almost like a flipped classroom kind of environment. We would do didactic classroom activities and then go to a lab and troubleshoot a circuit or demonstrate our ability to show decision making insofar as tracking down a fault in a piece of equipment. And then the amount of that simulation based activity increased throughout my entire, it was almost 2 years of training and education that I did before I was deployed to an aircraft carrier. I remember I was in Great Lakes, Illinois, a long, long time ago, and I was there for my electronics technician Class A school training. And not only was the practice almost all simulation, working on simulated radar units in these big instructional labs. We would have like 13 or 14 radar systems in a room, and each student had their own system to work on. And we would be led through fault analysis. We would be led through troubleshooting and study at nighttime, and then come back and do the simulations during the daytime. And that was also my first experience into high stakes testing, because each module closed out with an actual fault or failure in the radar system that you had to go in and troubleshoot and demonstrate not only your fundamental base knowledge of electricity and electronics, but how to logically approach troubleshooting a critical piece of equipment for a naval vessel. And I say high stakes because we had to pass each one before we could move on to the next segment of the training. And then that continued through my Class C schools, which are specialized areas of training in different pieces of equipment that I worked on when I was in the Navy. So that sort of embedded simulation in my mind, but I didn't even realize it until later on in life. As I was when I was winding up my duties in the Navy, the last couple of years, I was on a shore duty station in Virginia Beach, and I started teaching at Tidewater Community College in the CT, cardiac technician and paramedic programs for pre-hospital care personnel. And then we were using a lot of simulation, but again, we weren't calling it simulation. It was sort of the old Laerdal rhythm generators and the old fake defibrillators to deliver charges, and we were testing people then and training them with simulation. And we just thought it was the normal fare, in terms of deliberate practice and those kinds of things. But again, we didn't call it that back then. So when I moved on and got to be more formally introduced into what was becoming the world of healthcare simulation, it was kind of all making sense to me retrospectively, if you will.
Well, when you talk about your high stakes exam, it was more than high stakes, because if you didn't know how to do it, someone would have died in real life, I imagine.
Yeah, well, so a couple things. One of the pieces that I specialized in the Navy when I was deployed is something called the identification of friend or foe equipment, and it's the IFF system. And how that works is the IFF system sends out digital pulses, basically, that go out with the radar of the ship, and they come back. And the display and the decoding of the crypto digital signals we send out lets the people running the ship and pointing the guns, if you will, know whether a target they see is friendly, unknown, or an enemy. So it's high stakes operations all around. And when that piece of equipment would go down, there was a mad scramble and an absolute mandate to get it up back and running as fast as possible. So yes, it was high stakes testing for a high stakes deployment environment.
And it almost sounded like mastery learning, the way you described it, because it sounds like to move to the next level, you had to pass. What was the consequence of not passing? Would you just go back and practice more until you could get it?
Yeah, it was high stakes, and it was before that we knew that psychological safety was important. There wasn't a soft landing with a nice debriefing. It was you fail and you're going back a week. And if you failed, I don't remember because it didn't happen to me, but if you failed 3 modules total in that 6 months Class A training I did at Great Lakes, you were basically out of the electronics program of the Navy.
Wow. Have they changed it since? Do you know?
I don't know, quite frankly. I don't know. I know that the simulation parts still exist, and that's a big part of the electronics training. But I don't know how much they've embraced the new era of simulation that includes psychological safety and a debriefing to figure out why somebody did something wrong as much as they did something wrong. And in fairness to my faculty and instructors way back when, we're talking 30 years ago, is they were understaffed and lots of people coming through. And I think they just didn't have a lot of time. And basically it was sort of a tough love kind of training environment.
Another thing that strikes me is they use the term fail because we try and not use that terminology anymore because, it's not really failure. It's not really high stakes in that we try and for most things, let people do it again and do the debriefing, let them practice more until they can be excellent again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's kinder, gentler, sort of the healthcare variety of simulations, probably for a lot of good reasons, because after all, the recipients of our training have to have empathy, compassion at the bedside. So it stands to reason that in the training environment, when we're putting them in the vulnerable situations and those situations that are high pressure from the perception of the learner, that we, reward them with empathy, compassion in their quest to become better providers.
And then along your course, Paul, you actually had, I would say, the honor of serving a term as president of the Society for Simulation in Healthcare. Let's talk a little bit about your experience there and what was on your mind at that time when you were serving in the leadership role.
So, yeah, I served as the president of the society in 2013. I think I was the 8th president of the society, had been involved in it essentially from the beginning. It was, I think, times where simulation was moving forward, but we needed to kind of propel it forward more. The administrations before me had just launched accreditation, had the certification was in the works. And I'd say that, a lot of eyes were on professionalization of simulation. And that was, I think, an important kind of juncture for us. And Dr. David Gaba and others were ferociously doing legislative agendas, trying to push simulation forward. And so simultaneously, I think the society was helping by professionalizing the environment, because it makes things an easier sell as we move it forward for people that are outside of healthcare and don't understand what simulation is all about. So I think that was one of the things that I was thinking about quite a bit during my years. I had about 6 years on the board of directors and then was president kind of right in the middle of that.
So the fascinating thing about that is that was almost 10 years ago. And when I interviewed Haru Okuda, who's the serving president right now in 2022, he mentioned the same thing as about the importance of getting legislation through to recognize simulation and importance. And we had a lot of discussion about that and where that should go. So, and again, this segues into what I was planning on talking about your plenary that you just gave at the IMSH international meeting in Los Angeles this past year. But that we were talking about, despite the fact that simulation research has shown the field improves patient safety, gives return on investment, it's not quite where we hoped it would be. And that even goes back to some of the earlier studies in the 2006, 2009 time. And then you were still working on it in 2013, and it appears it's still an important initiative for the society to pass legislation, et cetera, to make simulation maybe mandatory for certain types of professions or more on the funding agenda for the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, I think that we've been thinking about it, acting on it in incremental steps for a long time. I agree with you that we're not as far along as we probably thought we would be, particularly if you look back, let's say 15 years. And I remember David Gaba doing a plenary. I can't remember what year, it was a long time ago. And he was being his normal provocative self and had two pathways of simulation in his plenary. Like, one was we go on and it's fully integrated into everything we do and patients are safer and the world is better. And the other is simulation is gone. And all the reasons why that could happen, and it was compelling. I'd say that we keep making incremental gains, but I don't think that we've hit that steep part of full integration and adoption of simulation on the healthcare operations side. I think our schools have embraced simulation in a great way. When I say schools, I mean schools of health sciences, nursing, pharmacy, medicine, for the most part. Of course, lots of other different schools of health sciences, but they've fully embraced it. I mean, our medical school, nursing school, and pharmacy schools do tremendous amount of simulation at the University of Pittsburgh. But the hospital operations side is still struggling. Despite your work, which I cite your central line work in almost every safety talk that I do, you have some of the most, I think, compelling and conclusive stories to say, why are we not saying there's an ethical problem if we are not pursuing simulation with mastery learning for central line placement, but there's, healthcare's tough. The operations side of healthcare, funding and finance are always under fire and under stress. And the ability to make changes, unfortunately, comes down to revenue pressure, as well as regulatory and legislative pressures. And the regulatory and legislative changes that need to happen to mandate anything are small and slow and kind of move at the pace of icebergs. And it's sad. And I think that if we were having an interview or a chat with Lucian Leap or other people that were founders of the modern patient safety movement, they would also say that we're not as far along as we thought we would be when all the splash was created in 2000 and the 2010 timeframe that kind of set motions in forward, set the modern patient safety movement into motion. I think healthcare leaders of today are concerned about quality. I think they're deeply concerned about safety. I think they oftentimes don't know what to do with it. And then I think that there are aspects of it that the community of simulation, we've kind of stubbed our own toes a bit along the way as well.
So we're over 20 years since the IOM report, right? I don't know how far along we've moved. At least simulation, as you said, hasn't moved where it should be. And you mentioned revenues, and it seems like there's a setback almost every year in revenue. And now we would say it was COVID, and then we would say now it's the great nursing shortage where hospitals are paying 2.5 to 3 times what they normally would pay a nurse because they're travel nurses. So it's not a great time to throw a lot of money into simulation. However, at the same time, if you recall the hospitalist movement back, the early 2000s, late 1990s, was successful because of the ability to show the C-suites the return on investment and the reduction in length of stay that hospitalists could provide. And then boom, hospitalists just took off like crazy. So I'm just kind of trying to think why, when we show the return on investment for SIM that's so clear, why it's not taking off as much as the hospitalist movement did. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that just take one step back to start to answer the question, then I'll answer the question full on. But I think when I said that, we own a little bit of this from the simulation community, I think that we haven't been as diligent as we probably should have been to collect all of our data and to begin to have a trove of data that we can put together a multifactorial return on analysis or return on investment analysis. And what I mean by that is very few papers and very few studies like yours and your follow-on studies that demonstrated the economic savings associated with a particular safety thing actually make it to the academic literature. So it's sort of shrouded in local projects and local advances. The other thing in the simulation community is everybody goes everywhere with simulation, depending on what the domain of the founding of their center was, who the funders were, etc. So there's not a lot of people sort of marching in the same direction that makes it easy to do large scale multi-center trials to kind of make publications come to fruition that are beyond one particular procedure. I believe it starts with documenting lots of different procedures, but then somehow we have to accumulate a lot of evidence across the board for lots of different procedures, pathways, and effects of simulation. The other thing is, I think that return on investment isn't always about just a spreadsheet analysis. The thing that I think that we need to move towards in the community of simulation, those of us working in hospital operations side, is looking at more of a complete financial and complete return on analysis that includes things that are intangible and very, very difficult to measure. Recruitment and retention of nurses is a huge one. It's never factored into simulation ROI. Downstream costs are rarely factored into ROI studies, meaning if simulation decreases a fall in the hospital, it's, for example, the calculation of the cost of that fall and the downstream care to the patient is rarely ever calculated into that expense. So what it comes out to is you go to the C-suite, in my case, a $24 billion healthcare company. You go to the C-suite and talk about improving one particular pathway of healthcare, which is a small tip of the iceberg by itself. You don't get a lot of traction as much as talking about lots of things like I said, recruitment and retention, things that are intangible, patient care that is better at the bedside from a qualitative perspective as well as a quantitative perspective. And I think that we need all of that packaged together to articulate a better return on investment, to make a more compelling argument directly to people running healthcare today, but also to the legislatures and the accrediting bodies that can make those changes that I talked about earlier that occur at the pace of iceberg movements, that will start to put threads of mandatory and compulsory acts of simulation into the repertoire of a hospital. I don't know if I did a YouTube video a long time ago, and I think I did a blog article a while back on it, but it's sort of comparing, why is every hospital in this country compelled to have a high-tech fire alarm system and pay for the installation and maintenance of it, but they're not compelled to do the same thing with simulation to keep people safe? I don't remember the last time a hospital burned down to the ground.
That's actually a great point. So I guess what you're saying is the hospitalist movement had a lot of data, multi-center data. We don't have that. And, you're right on with the legislative issue. I mean, we know how hard it is to get grants for simulation and for education. There's just not a lot of funding out there to fund this research, especially in ROI. I mean, we've been successful in obtaining NIH grants in small areas, but not, the big multi-center trial. And maybe this is a future topic to be discussed through the society of kind of helping to leverage that and forming a strong consortium of centers that can collaborate on research. We have work to do. We certainly do.
Agree. And to your comments of the, getting some simulation groups together to do it, I think that while I do think it would be a herding cat kind of initiative, I think that is one way forward. And I do think some of the work that we did with the society has helped set the stage for that. I mean, the accreditation process, I think, helps set some standards to recognize different areas of domain expertise that a given simulation program puts forward and has an external review of. And I've always been a fan of thinking that we probably should be marketing the idea of program competence through accreditation to help figure out who could be at that table and who is likely to have the infrastructure to produce the research at a level of quality that we would need if we were going to embark upon a multi-center trial for some aspect of simulation. And I think it's really, really important. And yes, I completely agree with you. We have a lot of work to do.
All right. So we've talked about a lot of the things with legislation, revenue, being better at doing multi-center trials to really hammer this home, which, again, I think maybe we can push that forward through the society. Long term, though, from here, we're 15, 20 years into where simulation is slowly growing. It's going still up that hill. It has not reached its peak by any means, and it should never reach its peak, I hope. But where are we headed? Is it going to be another 10, 20 years before we're where we want to be?
No, I don't know, Jeff. I hope that it doesn't take us 10 to 20 years, but I remain optimistic. I remain optimistic that we will be moving forward, and I think that some of these regulatory and accrediting issues are coming to a head. One of the if there's an upside to COVID, I think that it has created a lot more pressure to recognize competency and clinical training environments that I think are ripe for simulation. And so I think the astute leaders with some vision are taking this time. I mean, we certainly are at Pitt, taking this time to really shove the wedge of simulation in further to the C-suite as a mechanism for lots of things. The transition to practice thing that I talk about often, meaning how do we take new grads, of which now we're increasing the number of students per class, we're increasing the number of classes, increasing the number of schools because of the nursing shortage and shortage of other healthcare providers. We're in a year or so, we're going to have all these new grads that have these transition to practice difficulties that I personally think simulation is the only thing to really help absorb some of the bumpiness that goes along with that. And I think as those things come to fruition, the regulators, the accreditors will take note. And I don't think there's going to be any turning back from the insatiable desire to improve quality and reduce cost within your own hospital, within your own healthcare system, as well as those who pay for healthcare. So I think that the pressures that the C-suite are under are higher than they ever have been. So I look at it as a time that we can kind of advance simulation, if you will, and hopefully at a faster pace that we had before. And then the other thing is, I think over the last 20, 25 years, Jeff, that you and I have been involved in simulation, we figured out a lot of where the sweet spot of current simulation is. We know what we are very, very capable of. And we also probably have a more realistic view now of what the limitations are, because I think that that's a very important thing when we as senior leaders are advising others on how to use the tool of simulation. We want to make sure that we are advancing the field and demonstrating the highest efficacy with the best efficiency and cost consciousness that we can. That will garner the respect of the C-suite into the future so that we can continue to move it forward.
Well, the other thing too, though, is that having enough faculty and staff that actually can assist with doing the simulation training, because we have certain experts at our institution, but we don't have enough that really know how to do simulation, how to develop curricula in simulation, and how to use it and look at translational science outcomes. And I know you have done a lot of work at Weiser and at UPMC on faculty development. So I kind of wanted to take the opportunity for you to talk a little bit about your experience with that and what you're doing locally.
So a long time ago, we partnered with the Gordon Center for Medical Research and Education at University of Miami, and we created a faculty development program for simulation called ISIM, which stands for Improving Simulation Instructional Methods. And we were doing this way before it was vogue to do faculty development training in simulation, probably for 17 years now. And we adopted a methodology because our centers have some similar operational features that were unique at the time. I think they're not as unique now, but still unique in some circumstances, where we don't espouse the idea that everybody that comes in and creates and teaches a simulation-based program needs to be a simulation expert. I think a long time ago, a lot of us thought that that was going to be the pathway. But I think if you're operationally minded, you realize you run out of steam with that kind of process. And instead, we adopted a model of expert curriculum and competent facilitator. And we use the ISIM course to get people from no simulation experience, but recognize their subject matter expertise, to competency with simulation in terms of various aspects like introduction to debriefing, the vulnerability students feel with simulation, selection of different types of simulation modalities, cost effectiveness, efficiency in your scenario design, as well as basic debriefing and those kinds of things. But approach it from a perspective of, we're not trying to make them into a simulation expert. We're trying to get them to a level of competency, and we've had great success in that locally in Miami and Pittsburgh. We've taken the course all over the country, and then we've translated it to Korean, to Japanese, and then I've done an extensive work in China and have been able to spread this idea. We went and created a family of these courses. So our course called ISIM Fundamentals is what I just described. It's sort of like no simulation to basic competency in simulation. And then we have some other courses that we run less frequency, but they're much high intensity in terms of ISIM assessment tool development, ISIM research, ISIM advanced debriefing for those people that do want to go on and develop further expertise in simulation. Because I think the future of simulation is going to be partnerships between those with simulation expertise and those with clinical expertise coming together to be able to competently run simulation programs.
So let's say I'm interested in taking your ISIM fundamentals course. What does that look like for the individual? Like, how much time does it take? Is it online? How much is in person, et cetera, to complete that course for the minimal competency?
Yeah, it's still on site. It's an on-site course, and it's 2 days, the ISIM fundamentals, and that gives people the basic background in simulation. There's some pre-course work that goes on that probably takes about 2 or 3 hours of online education that is a preparation for the 2 days. And then it's two long but fun 8-hour days that people actually go through the conceptualization of an idea and turn it into what we call a mini simulation 2 different times, once each day. And each day we focus on different pathways, or not pathways. We focus on different decision making within the scenario design, within the scenario execution, to allow things to be realized when the teams run the simulations on each other at the end of the day. So some days we focus on the first day we focus on sort of the equipment selection and the debriefing, and then the second day we give an introduction to using assessment tools into the simulation, and then we do another focus on the debriefing part, and as well as the incorporation of the assessment tools into the simulation. And at the end of day 2, we run simulations on each other that were created during that day.
And you run these courses, it sounds like, in many different locations. And it sounds like anyone that wants it can go ahead and sign up on a website and go to the location.
They run, so the courses run several times a year at our primary development sites in Miami, as well as Pittsburgh. Then they run 2 or 3 times a year at the University of Hawaii, and our other developmental partners at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia. And, they're advertised on the websites. People can sign up and, attend the courses. And then the other thing that we've been doing a lot of, during COVID and since COVID is, and I think this has to do with more simulation programs opening or expanding, which again brings out the optimist in me, is people are hiring us to come on site, and train a mass of people because, once you're going to send 8 or 9 people out of town for a training, a multi-day training endeavor, the cost sort of starts rolling over of, can we get a cohort at home and bring the program to home, to be able to, afford it, as well as there's advantages to that in, when you're training new people to actually train in the center where they're going to work with the equipment that they're using and they get some hands-on at the locale as well.
So it sounds like you don't have one in the Midwest. It sounds like something we'd be interested in hosting here as well.
We should talk about this, Jeff. I'd like that.
Yeah, as you know, we already do a mastery learning course. It's a 3-day immersive, and it's been on site, and we offer it about twice yearly. But I think there's a lot of interest in ramping it up, and we haven't taken that show on the road yet either. The other interesting thing that we often are faced with is how do we develop our own faculty? We've all seen a course going on in the sim lab where the debriefing session failed to create a safe learning environment because the faculty didn't have the proper training in debriefing. So how do you go about that with your own faculty? Are they required, or do you suggest that they take the ISIM course?
We do, and we make the So a couple of things, I guess I should roll back to answer the question at a higher level. We invest in internal faculty development first. We run regular recurring sessions about every other month on debriefing and facilitation and simulation. We highly and strongly encourage new faculty members to, at a minimum, attend them, as well as we have some online training that is required of faculty for introduction to psychological safety in the training environment, and a number of other online offerings that we give to our faculty internally. The other thing is, when we run the ISIM course, most of the time it's people from outside the area coming in, and we always reserve and offer seats to essentially at just cost for internal participants from either the UPMC Health System or the University of Pittsburgh Schools of Health Sciences. And then a number of times per year, we run specialty symposiums that we try to focus on the PIT community, if you will. Earlier this year, we had a super special one. We did a DEI focus on simulation that was an all-day symposium. Every year, we highlight simulation work, and there's usually at least one introductory topic. Sometimes people just think simulation is a daunting task, and some of it comes from not knowing how much work we do inside our programs to help faculty succeed. And I think when we can break down those barriers and get people to come in and go through the process of developing a course or something like that, we end up with winners on the other side, in terms of they become enthusiastic and passionate about simulation, and hopefully will lead the next generation of educators. And then, of every 10 to 15 people that pass through one of those introductory either symposiums, workshops, or lectures, we probably get one that gets bit by the bug, and then they go on, they join the SSH, they go to meetings, they get certified, and kind of march on a pathway of expertise, which I think we need for the future.
That's all awesome. And you've actually given me some ideas for my own institution, and offline we'll talk more about how we can collaborate in the future. But before we wrap up, I wanted to give you a chance to plug your blog. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your blog? Because I was kind of reading through some of it, and it's really cool.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. My blog is at simulatinghealthcare.net. And it's a free WordPress blog. And basically it just started off with, every once in a while I would find some topic that people either struggled with or there was some kind of big controversial, thing. And then I would just kind of write it out, pound it out. And I don't have a regular cadence or rhythm for how often I do it. I generally, it's based on some experience I had to say, wow, this is really something great the simulation community is doing, or wow, this is really crazy and probably could use some course correction in terms of something that I have seen going on. And I try to write it in a tongue-in-cheek style that's, maybe a 5 or 10 minute read. And then sometimes I link it to other assets that are available on the web that I think that I found useful over time. But it's really been an interesting thing. And I just kind of started it as a little hobby a long time ago, and have a lot of subscribers and regular readers. And now people send me topics and say, hey, can you write about this? So it's just been kind of a fun project.
That's really cool. I really want to thank you for taking the time today to talk to me. I learned a lot, as always, when I do this, and I look forward to the potential for future collaborations with Wiser and yourself.
Thanks, Jeff. It was great talking to you. And on behalf of the simulation community, thank you for doing this work, because I think it just contributes to the richness and to the future of simulation.
Well, thank you for listening today. In our next series of podcasts, we will continue to discuss the key aspects of simulation healthcare education with experts like Paul in the simulation field. Bye for now.